set, go. We began this class back in chapter number 1 talking about the origins of mankind. Most historians believe that human history begins in the continent of Africa, where after a process of several hundreds of thousands of years, species evolve and change from ancient hominids, which are an ape-like creature, all the way up to modern-day Homo sapiens sapiens. Somewhere around 20,000 to 40,000 BCE, our species fought off the last of the other subspecies, the Neanderthals, and were the only ones left on the planet. At that point, people are living as nomadic hunter-gatherers, traveling from place to place to place, and migrate throughout the entire world as you see it right here. Somewhere around 10,000 BCE, humans figured out a way to live that's different. Agriculture or farming. That was in chapter 1 and then into chapter number 2. Farming begins here in Mesopotamia, and from there will spread to 3 other locations: Egypt, India, and China. These are your earliest civilization centers. For the first 3, they have some commonalities. They are polytheistic in their religion in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India. In each of these locations, you're ruled by kings that we believe are religious in nature, so we call these theocracies, where you've got this godlike king ruling over you. We see major structures being built in 2 of these locations: ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Egypt. Indus River Valley is complicated for us because we don't have written records coming out of here. We know they built complex cities. We think they had a polytheistic religious belief, but we don't know a lot of detail. China is the oddball in that early history time period because China is not necessarily a theocracy. They believe in the mandate of heaven, this idea that their ruler, their emperor, is chosen by the universe, and everyone has a responsibility to play, but they don't necessarily worship their emperor in that process. As we go forward, around 2000 BCE, things change quite a bit. You have the building of the first empires, starting with Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, followed by Pharaoh solidifying power within Egypt. These empires span multiple regions, so as before they've been different city-states in a lot of these places, they become unified under one ruler. Once you do that, religions start to become more commonplace. Not a coincidence, I think, you're going to see the first monotheistic religion, Judaism, coming out around this time period. Now, what also makes things different is they're invaded. Revenge of the nomads. Around 2000 BCE or so, Indo-Europeans are going to invade down into India, into Mesopotamia, and the Hyksos come into Egypt too. And that kind of shatters what people had thought before. They didn't focus necessarily on defending themselves as staunchly, but when these guys riding chariots and horseback come in and start charging and ruin stuff, makes them rethink civilization. As we go forward to finish up this early time period, civilization changes its location and grows more complex. You have the Greeks rising up here in Europe, followed by the Romans over in Italy. Rome and Greece change the game in that they're not theocracies. Greece establishes direct democracy in Athens. Rome performs itself as a republic. However, by the end of this time period, Rome has become a dictatorship under the Caesars. And at the end of 500 or so CE, you've got this Silk Roads connecting Europe out here in the west, all the way across to China in the east, with the Han Empire down here, the Roman Empire over here, and various groups kind of connected in the middle. We haven't talked about the Americas at all because we don't know a ton about them, but a couple names you might remember: the Olmec and the Zapotec, early peoples here in Central America, the Nazca, the Chavín, and the Moche down here in South America, and humans we believe migrating across this land bridge, Beringia, from Asia to the New World is the way we think that early humans arrived here in the Americas. It's a big, broad summary of that first time period. My time on time?
You have 11 minutes and 17 seconds.
Okay, so I've given you a huge chunk here for this prehistory time period. A couple things to finish up. We don't talk a ton about Africa or the Americas because we lack written language. We have some early civilizations like the Nook culture out here with their capital city of Gengeno, but we don't know exactly what happened for them. We've got the Nubians down here south of Egypt. They've been brought in as slaves, conquered by the Egyptians. They eventually accepted kind of Egyptian culture. We don't know much except for China out here. You don't really have Japan or Korea. These are the places forming their own civilizations. They're all kind of loosely modeled after China early on in this time period. And over here in India, you have the emergence of a new civilization or culture with the Aryans coming in, with Indo-Europeans. You have 2 major empires, the Mauryans and the Guptans. You have 2 major religions coming out of here, Hinduism followed by Buddhism in this time period as well. So India's kind of different. All right, I should be through my 5 minutes on the classical, and hopefully you've jotted down some of the things I said that you're at least familiar with. We're ready to now move on to the second major time period of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages begins with another revenge of the nomads. In this case, we call these people the Huns or the Hunas. Guys like Attila, who are storming and wrecking weakened empires. By 500 or so CE, Rome has become less focused on the needs of its citizens due to inflation and hiring mercenaries. Rome is incredibly vulnerable, and eventually it splits, with the Western Roman Empire completely falling apart, and the only part of Rome left, the Byzantine Empire, here with its capital in Constantinople. As for China, same story. The Han Dynasty falls apart, but China's able to come back a lot easier. During the Middle Ages, you have the Tang and the Song dynasties of China, which are almost as prosperous as the Han, and reestablish a lot of trade of silk and other precious items like porcelains across this Silk Road. But the major story of the Middle Ages is the rise of this new force in the Middle East. On the remnants or the ruins of the Mesopotamians, you have a new religion being born with its leader Muhammad. The religion is Islam. And Islam is going to expand and spread across southern Asia into India and also across into Africa, controlling trade routes out here with groups like the Almohads and Almoravids, engaging in trade with African trading empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. All right, so you've got Islam playing a major role religiously and through trade. You have large Muslim empires like the Umayyads and the Abbasids establishing dominance in this huge area here. Meanwhile, back in Europe, what do you got? A bunch of small fighting kingdoms. In Western Europe, you have a system called feudalism. You've got different warrior chieftains competing for turf, the Franks, the Celts, all these different groups carving out their own little niches. The one thing unifying Western Europe is the religion. The religion that's left over from the Roman Empire is the Catholic Church, with the Pope in Rome kind of unifying and bringing together a little bit these different monarchies, and these monarchs will compete and fight with each other for power. You have some success of building empires, like Charlemagne builds the Carolingian Empire. It's pretty big. You have the Holy Roman Empire that's fairly large, but nothing to compare to the Umayyad and Abbasids out here for the Muslims. As for China, China's not controlled by Islam. They're still off on their own, though they've adopted an Indian religion. Buddhism was brought to them by the end of the classical age, and so you see in the Tang and Song era, Buddhism plays a huge role. You also see the formation of new civilizations in Asia. This is when Japan is born. It's a Heian period, it's golden age, where they've got an emperor that people believe is a god. They've got their unique religion of Shinto. They're modeling their society culturally after China, with Confucianism playing a role here. That same time period in the Middle Ages, you've also got new Asian cultures like the Koryu dynasty or the Dai Viet, down here what will become Vietnam. All of them like little planets orbiting around China's influence culturally upon them. Okay? As for the Americas in this Middle Ages period, the Americas are going to have their first major empires, including your first one with written language. That one's called the Maya down here. You've also got, by the end of this time period, the Aztecs rising up here in Mexico. You've got the Inca establishing themselves down here in South America. And you've got a variety of Native American tribes up here in North America, such as the Anasazi down here in Arizona, the Mississippians, and the Iroquois up here in the northeast part of North America. All right, by the time you get to the end of this Middle Ages period, Islam has established itself as probably the largest ruling religion territorially, but Europe is starting to emerge. They've gone through what's called the Commercial Revolution. After the Black Plague had hit in the 100 Years' War, you have the rise of a middle class. So Europe economically starts to have technology increase. They're on the verge of having the Renaissance. And they're starting, by the end of this period, to have Portugal invest in sailing technologies to potentially start to explore the rest of the world. So we can kind of hint at what's going to come in the Age of Exploration. Meanwhile, for Islam, yeah, it spread and ruled huge territories, but you're also starting to see the Turks play a bigger role, and outsiders rule, such as the Ottoman Empire breaking away from the Abbasids, the Safavid Empire with Shias out here in Iran, and the Mughal Empire in northern India, all of them kind of fragmenting. So you start to see Islam kind of weaken. You see China get kind of stagnant. Add on top of that, they're being invaded by what group? The Mongols, by the end of this period, coming in and wrecking a lot of what had been built by Muslims, by the Chinese, by a new area called Russia up here. And so all of this is paving the way for our last time period. How am I on time now?
You have 5 minutes and 40 seconds.
Perfect. So we're transitioning from this Middle Ages period. We're seeing weakening because of Mongol invasion a lot of these other areas, while Western Europe is left untouched. By 1450, then, Western Europe is able to culturally transform itself. You've got the Renaissance being born in Italy and then spreading to the rest of Europe. You've got the Reformation breaking the Catholic Church's grip on everyone within European societies. And so consequently, you have this new burgher middle class with educated individuals who might question the traditional status quo and might try crazy new things, like Columbus sailing west across the Atlantic to try to find a route to Asia, but instead finding the Americas. Like the Portuguese sailing south and setting up trade networks around Africa and eventually up into India and China. And so during the Age of Exploration, it's really the story of how Europeans explore huge chunks of the world, begin trading across the globe, connecting the globe, and also begin conquering territory and exploiting it for its resources. So we talked, for example, about European colonization in the New World. You know the major European countries that are setting up huge colonies out here, the Portuguese in Brazil, the Spanish on the coast of South America and up into Mexico and the Caribbean, the British over here on the coast of North America, the French up here in Canada, and the Netherlands with their small outpost here in New Amsterdam. All these people are taking advantage of Native American weakness, some more than others. You have Spanish coming in and conquering and killing, and then bringing in who? Well, you've got the triangle trade set up, where you've got slaves being taken from African societies, and that's being kind of fostered by the Portuguese, starting civil wars over here on the west coast of Africa, and then bringing these slaves over through the Middle Passage to come to work in plantations in the New World. So part of this story of the Age of Exploration is Europeans really exploiting and hurting Africans and Americans for their own gain and profit. The major commodity being used for trade now is precious metals, specifically silver, being extracted from mines out here and used by the Spanish to, well, do what they want. So we talked about how Europe goes through these changes, how you have Spain establish itself as the new power in the world, but use their wealth to buy armies and navies which they use to fight a war against Protestantism, and that backfires in their faces. Spain loses its global empire, like Don Quixote explained in that metaphor. And they're replaced by France. And France starts off as a tolerant society, working well with other different religions and ideas. But eventually they too get involved in a war, the War of Spanish Succession, and they lose all of their power and influence. And eventually after the French and Indian War, it's the British that are the new top dogs by the end of the Age of Exploration, controlling huge chunks of territory in the Americas and having the strongest navy in the world. What about Asia? Well, China had, at the start of this period, had its own sailing technology. You had the Ming Dynasty after the Mongols were defeated. You had Zheng He sailing across the Indian Ocean, right? But after his exploration, the Chinese decided to not get involved anymore. They stopped exploring the rest of the world. They become isolated on their own thing. Same thing goes for Japan. Japan had gone through a period of conflict. You had different daimyo competing to become the next shogun. As shogun replaced the emperors as the powers leading Japan. Eventually they're going to unify. We talked about this unification process with Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and eventually the Tokugawa shogunate. But then Japan chooses to isolate itself. They don't want to be involved in foreign affairs. So you see Europe getting involved everywhere, while Asia is like isolationist, not really wanting to get involved in conflicts. All right. As for Africa, not much to talk about, sadly, for them, because you've got the slave trade kind of siphoning a lot of people and wealth out of Africa and fragmenting what had been unified empires like Anamali and Songhai. All right. Time? Okay, so I finished a little bit early. I haven't talked about Australia. We know there are people there called Aborigines, but we don't know anything about them, so we leave them alone. I haven't talked about Antarctica. But you've got, hopefully, a general, some things to think about at least for each of these time periods and the locations. Okay, stop recording me.